The summer morning broke hot and still across the fields near Klushino, halfway between Smolensk and Moscow. The year was 1610, and Russia was bleeding from a dozen wounds. In the distance, through the haze of dust and July heat, banners rippled above the largest army the broken Tsardom could muster. Perhaps 35,000 men, Russians and Swedish mercenaries together, arrayed in columns that stretched across the rolling farmland like a dark tide. Facing them, impossibly outnumbered, stood barely 4,000 Polish and Lithuanian horsemen under the command of Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski. They had marched deep into enemy territory with winter supplies running thin and reinforcements a distant dream. The odds were not merely against them, they were absurd. 8-1, 10-1, by some counts. The Russian commanders looked at those numbers and saw certain victory. The Polish king had sent his finest cavalry regiment into the jaws of annihilation. But Żółkiewski did not retreat. He did not entrench. He formed his horsemen into battle lines and waited for the thunder. This is the story of the battle that broke an empire. This is Klushino, the day Poland's winged hussars charged into legend and rode out as the masters of Moscow. To understand the madness of Klushino, you must first understand the chaos that consumed Russia in the early 1600s. They called it the time of troubles, Smutnoye Vremya, and it was as close to hell as a kingdom could fall without vanishing altogether. It began with the death of Tsar Fyodor I in 1598, the last of the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for 7 centuries. He left no heir. The throne sat empty, and like wolves to carrion, the boyars, Russia's noble elite, circled and schemed and tore at each other for power. Boris Godunov seized the crown through cunning and manipulation, but his reign was cursed from the start. Famine struck in 1601, then again in 1602 and 1603. Entire provinces starved. The dead filled mass graves by the tens of thousands. Bandits roamed the countryside, and peasants fled their lands. The people whispered that God had turned his face from Russia because the throne was stolen. Then came the pretenders. A man appeared in Poland claiming to be Dmitry Ivanovich, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, a boy who had died under mysterious circumstances years before. The real Dmitry was almost certainly dead, his throat cut in a rural monastery. But this false Dmitry was young, charismatic, and backed by Polish magnates hungry for influence in Russia. In 1604, he invaded with a small army of Polish volunteers and Cossack adventurers. Against all odds, he won. City after city opened their gates to him. When Boris Godunov died suddenly in 1605, some said poisoned, some said broken by despair, false Dmitry marched into Moscow and took the throne. He lasted 11 months. In May 1606, a mob of boyars led by Vasily Shuisky stormed the Kremlin, dragged false Dmitry from his bed, and butchered him in the streets. They burned his body, mixed the ashes with gunpowder, and fired them from a cannon pointed west, back toward Poland. Shuisky declared himself Tsar Vasily IV and promised stability. He delivered only more chaos. Almost immediately, another pretender appeared. False Dmitry II, even more dubious than the first. He set up camp outside Moscow with an army of Poles, Cossacks, and Russian rebels, laying siege to the capital while Shuisky cowered behind the Kremlin walls. Russia now had 2 Tsars, one inside Moscow, one outside it. Neither commanded respect. Neither could restore order. The boyars, desperate and humiliated, turned to Poland. In February 1610, they signed a treaty with King Sigismund III of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They would recognize Sigismund's son, Prince Władysław, as the new Tsar of Russia. if Poland would send an army to crush the pretenders and restore peace. It was a devil's bargain, trading one foreign threat for another, but the boyars believed they had no choice. King Sigismund, however, had grander ambitions. He did not simply want his son on the Russian throne. He wanted Russia itself, absorbed into the Commonwealth, broken and humbled, its vast lands divided among Polish magnates. And so he sent Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski, one of the greatest military minds of the age, to march on Moscow with a small but elite force of cavalry. Żółkiewski's orders were clear: defeat the pretenders' army, secure the capital, and pave the way for a Polish occupation. But first, he would have to fight through the largest Russian army ever assembled to stop him. Stanisław Żółkiewski was 55 years old in the summer of 1610, a career soldier whose entire life had been war. He had fought Tatars on the southern steppes, Swedes in the Baltic, Moldavians in the Carpathians. He had commanded cavalry charges that broke entire armies and negotiated treaties that reshaped borders. He was not a man of grand gestures or fiery speeches. He was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly effective. When King Sigismund ordered him to march into the heart of Russia with barely 4,000 men, Żółkiewski did not argue. He understood the mission's impossibility. He also understood that in war, impossibility was simply another variable to be calculated and overcome. His army was small, but it was extraordinary. At its core were the winged hussars, Poland's legendary heavy cavalry, the most feared horsemen in Europe. They wore burnished steel armor that gleamed like mirrors, and from their backs rose enormous wings made of eagle or ostrich feathers, fixed to wooden frames that arced over their shoulders. When they charged, those wings caught the wind and roared, a sound like the breath of demons or the beating of giant birds. The noise alone could shatter enemy morale before the first lance struck home. But the hussars were more than spectacle. They were killers. Each hussar was a nobleman, trained from childhood in horsemanship and the use of the kopia, a lance nearly 18 feet long, designed to punch through armor and skewer men like wheat. After the lance shattered, they drew sabers and pistols, cutting and shooting their way through enemy ranks with terrifying efficiency. They fought in tight formations, knee to knee, moving as one organism. A hussar charge was not a chaotic brawl. It was a precision instrument of death. Żółkiewski also commanded Lithuanian light cavalry, mounted musketeers, and a small contingent of dragoons, infantry who could fight on horseback when needed. His army was mobile, flexible, and built for rapid strikes. It was not designed to hold ground or besiege cities. It was designed to kill enemy armies in open battle and keep moving. And moving is exactly what Żółkiewski did. In late spring of 1610, he marched east from the Polish frontier towards Smolensk, the great fortress city that guarded the road to Moscow. He bypassed fortified towns, avoided sieges, and pushed his cavalry hard across muddy roads and swollen rivers. His goal was not to conquer territory. It was to reach Moscow before the Russian army could organize and before False Dmitry II's forces could interfere. But the Russians were watching. Tsar Vasily Shuisky, still clinging to power in Moscow, knew that Żółkiewski's arrival could either save or destroy him. If the Poles crushed the pretenders' forces, Shuisky might survive. If the Poles decided to depose him and install Prince Władysław, he was finished. Either way, he needed to stop the Polish advance long enough to secure his own position. So Shuisky assembled the largest army Russia could muster in its current broken state. He scraped together perhaps 35,000 men. Some accounts say more, some less, but all agree it was a massive force compared to Żółkiewski's tiny cavalry detachment. The army was commanded by Prince Dmitry Shuisky. the Tsar's younger brother, a proud and overconfident nobleman who had never fought a battle of this scale. Alongside the Russians marched a large contingent of Swedish mercenaries, led by the experienced commander Jakub de la Gardie. The Swedes had been hired to fight false Dmitry II, but now they turned their pikes and muskets toward the Poles. The Russian plan was simple: march west from Moscow, intercept Żółkiewski near Smolensk, and crush his small force through sheer weight of numbers. Dmitry Shuisky believed victory was inevitable. He had 8 times as many men. He had artillery, infantry, and cavalry. He had Swedish professionals stiffening his ranks. Żółkiewski had 4,000 horsemen and a reputation. The two armies converged near the village of Klushino in late June 1610, and the Poles stopped. Żółkiewski did not retreat, did not entrench, did not try to slip away in the night. He simply waited for the Russians to come to him. He had chosen his ground. The fields around Klushino were not dramatic terrain. No towering mountains or deep ravines, no impenetrable forests or swift rivers. Just rolling farmland, dotted with patches of woodland and interrupted by gentle slopes. To an untrained eye, it looked like open ground, perfect for a massive infantry army to deploy and crush a smaller cavalry force through overwhelming numbers. But Żółkiewski did not have an untrained eye. He saw the shallow depressions where cavalry could form unseen. He saw the patches of marshy ground that would slow infantry but could be navigated by horsemen who knew the routes. He saw the tree lines that could hide reserves and the ridges that offered clear views of the battlefield. He saw, most importantly, the ways the terrain could be used to fragment and confuse a larger army, turning numbers from an advantage into a liability. Żółkiewski formed his cavalry into a defensive crescent, with the winged hussars at the center and lighter cavalry on the flanks. He positioned dragoons and mounted musketeers in shallow trenches and behind earthworks, enough to give the appearance of a prepared defensive position. He spread his forces just wide enough to look like an army trying to hold ground, inviting the Russians to attack in overwhelming strength. It was bait, and Prince Dmitry Shuisky took it. On the morning of July 4th, 1610, a bright, hot summer day, the Russian army deployed for battle. Dmitry Shuisky placed his infantry in the center, great blocks of Streltsy musketeers and pike formations, flanked by Russian cavalry and Swedish mercenary regiments. His artillery rolled forward, unlimbered, and began ranging shots toward the Polish positions. The Swedish commander, de la Gardie, argued for a more cautious approach: probe the Polish flanks, test their defenses, avoid a headlong assault. Dmitry Shuisky ignored him. He saw 4,000 Poles facing 35,000 Russians and Swedes. He saw an enemy who had marched deep into hostile territory and had nowhere to retreat. He saw a chance to annihilate the invaders and claim a glorious victory that would secure his brother's throne and his own reputation. So, he ordered a general advance. The Russian infantry began to march forward, drums beating, banners streaming. Thousands of boots trampled the dry grass. Musket companies moved in tight formations, their long matchlock weapons shouldered and ready. Cavalry squadrons rode on the wings, preparing to sweep around the Polish flanks and encircle the smaller force. Żółkiewski watched them come. He did not order a countercharge. He did not send his hussars forward in a reckless attack. He simply waited, letting the Russian army stretch itself across the battlefield, spreading out to match the width of the Polish line. The more they spread, the thinner their formations became. The more they advanced, the farther they moved from mutual support. And then, when the Russian infantry was halfway across the field, Żółkiewski gave the signal. The Polish dragoons and mounted musketeers opened fire. It was not a devastating volley, they were too few for that, but it was enough to stagger the leading Russian units and force them to slow, to bunch up, to lose the rhythm of their advance. The Russian artillery answered, cannonballs tearing through the Polish lines, but Żółkiewski's cavalry was spread too thin and too mobile to take concentrated fire. The shells ploughed furrows in the earth, but killed only a handful of men. The Russian infantry kept coming, confident in their numbers, confident in their strength. Żółkiewski let them get closer, closer still. And then he unleashed hell. The hussar charge began not with a shout, but with a sound like wind rushing through a forest. The beating of hundreds of wooden wings mounted on the backs of armored horsemen. It started as a low hum, then grew into a roar, a mechanical thunder that rolled across the battlefield and turned heads in the Russian ranks. Men who had never heard that sound before felt their guts twist. Men who had heard it before knew what was coming. Żółkiewski sent the hussars forward in waves, not all at once, but in carefully timed strikes designed to hit the Russian line at its weakest points. The first wave struck the left flank of the Russian infantry. 200 hussars moving at full gallop, lances lowered, wings screaming. The impact was catastrophic. The hussars did not slow when they hit the pike formations. They punched through like hammers through glass. The 18-foot lances drove into chests and throats, lifting men off their feet and hurling them backward into their comrades. The sheer weight and speed of the charge shattered the front ranks, and the horses trampled over the broken bodies, hooves crushing bones and armor. Behind the lances came sabers, flashing in the sunlight, cutting down men who tried to run or reform. The Russian left flank disintegrated in minutes. But Dmitry Szujski still had thousands of men. He ordered the Swedish mercenaries forward to plug the gap, and they came. Disciplined, professional, forming a wall of pikes and muskets. They were not Russian conscripts. They were veterans of European wars, men who had faced Spanish tercios and Dutch pike squares. They did not break at the first charge. Żółkiewski pulled the hussars back before they became entangled in a grinding melee. He reformed them behind his own lines, out of musket range, and sent them forward again, this time at a different angle, striking the Russian center where the infantry was thickest. The second charge hit like a thunderbolt. The Russians tried to brace. They leveled pikes, formed squares, shouted prayers and curses. It did not matter. The hussars came at them in a wedge formation, concentrated force aimed at a single point, and when they struck, the Russian center buckled. Lances snapped, sabers rose and fell, horses reared and kicked, their hooves weapons as deadly as any blade. Men screamed, not in rage, but in terror, as the armored giants tore through them like reapers through wheat. And still, the Russian army did not break. There were too many of them. They fought back with muskets and poleaxes, dragging hussars from their saddles, stabbing at horses, firing into the melee at point-blank range. Men died on both sides, tangled together in a writhing mass of steel and flesh. But Żółkiewski was not finished. While the hussars tore into the Russian center, he sent his Lithuanian light cavalry wide around the flanks. Fast, lightly armored horsemen, armed with bows and carbines. They did not charge into the enemy formations. They circled, harassed, shot into the flanks and rear of the Russian regiments, forcing them to turn, to split their attention, to lose cohesion. The Russian cavalry tried to respond, riding out to meet the Polish horsemen, but they were slower, heavier, and less disciplined. The Lithuanians refused to engage in a stand-up fight. They fired, wheeled away, fired again. They drew the Russian cavalry away from the main battle, fragmenting the enemy force. And then Żółkiewski struck again with the hussars. The third charge came from an unexpected angle, hitting the Russian right flank, where the Streltsy musketeers had formed a defensive line behind a low ridge. The hussars came over the ridge at full speed, wings roaring, and the Streltsy barely had time to raise their muskets before the lances were among them. The musketeers broke. They dropped their weapons and ran, streaming away from the battlefield in panic, and the panic spread. Fear is contagious on a battlefield. When one unit breaks, the men beside them see it and wonder if they should run too. When 2 units break, the question becomes urgent. When 3 break, the answer is obvious. The Russian army began to collapse. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when the entire force turned and fled. It happened in stages, like a building crumbling floor by floor. First, the flanks gave way, then the reserves, then the centre, where the Swedish mercenaries fought on with grim professionalism, trying to cover the retreat, trying to salvage something from the disaster. But there was nothing to salvage. Dmitry Shuisky, watching from a distant hill, saw his army disintegrating and made the worst decision of his life. Instead of ordering a fighting retreat, instead of rallying his men around the Swedish regiments and withdrawing in good order, he panicked. He sent out conflicting orders: stand and fight, fall back, hold the ridge, protect the artillery. The commands arrived garbled and contradictory, and the result was chaos. Regiments that should have supported each other instead collided, blocking roads and trails. Cavalry that should have screened the retreat instead rode straight into fleeing infantry, trampling their own men. Artillery pieces were abandoned, their crews running for their lives without spiking the guns, and the hussars kept coming. Żółkiewski did not let the Russians retreat in peace. He pursued them with relentless fury, sending wave after wave of cavalry into the broken formations, cutting down stragglers, capturing officers, driving the survivors into ever more desperate flight. The battle became a slaughter, and the slaughter became a rout. The Swedish mercenaries tried to hold a rearguard position near a grove of trees, forming a defensive square and daring the Poles to charge. Żółkiewski sent dragoons to pin them in place with musket fire, while the hussars circled around to cut off their escape. The Swedes fought with stubborn courage, firing volley after volley, but they were surrounded, outnumbered locally, despite the overall Russian numerical advantage, and running out of ammunition. Jakub Delegardy himself was wounded and captured, his regiment shattered. He had warned Dmitry Shuisky not to advance so recklessly. Now he watched from Polish captivity as the Russian army he had tried to save dissolved into a fleeing mob. By midday, the battlefield was a graveyard. Bodies lay in heaps where the hussars had charged. Russians, Swedes, Poles tangled together in death. Wounded men crawled through the trampled grass, calling for water, for mercy, for their mothers. Abandoned banners fluttered in the breeze, and the cannon stood silent, their barrels still warm, but their crews long gone. Żółkiewski's cavalry had suffered losses, perhaps a few hundred dead and wounded. But the Russian army had been annihilated. Estimates vary, but at least 5,000 Russians and Swedes lay dead on the field, and thousands more were captured or scattered into the countryside. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Officers were killed or taken prisoner. The artillery train, the baggage, the supply wagons, all captured. Prince Dmitry Shuisky fled back to Moscow with a few hundred survivors, his reputation destroyed, his army gone. He would never command troops again. Żółkiewski stood in the center of the battlefield, surrounded by his exhausted but victorious hussars, and looked east toward Moscow. The road was open. The Russian army that was supposed to stop him lay broken at his feet. There was nothing between his cavalry and the capital of Russia except empty roads and terrified towns. He gave the order to march. In the days following Klushino, the full scale of the disaster became clear to Tsar Vasily Shuisky. His brother's army, the largest force Russia could assemble, had been destroyed by a cavalry detachment 1/8 its size. The Swedish mercenaries who were supposed to be Russia's salvation were now prisoners of the Poles. The road to Moscow was undefended, and Żółkiewski was coming. But the hetman did not rush. He understood that taking Moscow was not a matter of military force, but of political timing. The city was still held by Shuisky's loyalists, and a direct assault would be bloody and uncertain. Instead, Żółkiewski marched slowly, methodically, letting news of the Klushino disaster spread ahead of him. The news did its work. In Moscow, the boyars, those same nobles who had invited Polish intervention in the first place, met in secret and decided that Vasily Shuisky had outlived his usefulness. He had failed to stop the pretenders. He had failed to restore order. He had failed to stop the Poles. In late July 1610, barely 3 weeks after Klushino, a group of boyars stormed the Kremlin, arrested Shuisky, forcibly tonsured him as a monk, and imprisoned him in a monastery. Russia had no Tsar. The boyars formed a provisional government, the Council of Seven, and opened negotiations with Żółkiewski. They repeated their earlier offer: recognize Prince Władysław as Tsar of Russia, and Poland would help restore order. Żółkiewski, ever the pragmatist, agreed. He marched his cavalry to the gates of Moscow and waited. On September 21st, 1610, Polish troops entered the Kremlin without firing a shot. Moscow, the capital of the largest country in Europe, was now occupied by a foreign power for the first time in its history. The boyars had traded one form of chaos for another, hoping that Polish rule would be temporary, that order would return, that Russia would emerge from the time of troubles intact. They were wrong. The occupation would last 2 years, a humiliating nightmare of foreign soldiers in the Sacred Heart of Russia, of Orthodox churches desecrated by Catholic troops, of Russian pride trampled under Polish boots. It would take a popular uprising, a peasant army, and a war of liberation to drive the Poles out and restore Russian sovereignty. But all of that lay in the future. On the day Żółkiewski's hussars rode through the gates of Moscow, they were conquerors. They had done what no enemy had done since the Mongols. They had taken the city that ruled half a continent. And they had done it because, on a hot summer day near a village called Klushino, 4,000 horsemen with wings on their backs had charged into an army 8 times their size and destroyed it utterly. The battlefield at Klushino lay quiet in the days after the fighting. The Polish cavalry moved on, chasing the remnants of the Russian army or marching toward Moscow. The local villagers emerged from hiding, picking through the wreckage, stripping the dead of weapons and armor, burying the bodies in mass graves or leaving them for the crows. The field had seen battles before. Russia's history was written in blood across 1,000 such places. But nothing like this. Not a defeat, but an obliteration. Not a retreat, but a rout so complete that the army ceased to exist. Żółkiewski's victory at Klushino entered legend almost immediately. In Poland, it was celebrated as one of the greatest triumphs in the Commonwealth's history, proof of the superiority of Polish arms and the invincibility of the winged hussars. Poets wrote epics about the battle. Priests gave sermons praising God's favor. King Sigismund commissioned paintings showing the hussars charging beneath divine light. In Russia, it was remembered differently, as a wound, a humiliation, a moment when the kingdom came closer to extinction than at any time since the Mongol invasions. The occupation of Moscow, the foreign Tsar, the loss of territory, All of it flowed from Klushino, from the moment when 35,000 men were shattered by 4,000 horsemen with wings. Stanisław Żółkiewski would go on to serve as Grand Hetman of Poland for another decade, winning more battles, negotiating more treaties, holding together a fragile Commonwealth through will and cunning. He would die in 1620 at the Battle of Takora, fighting the Ottoman Turks, his head taken as a trophy and displayed in Constantinople. But his name would be remembered longest for Klushino, the impossible victory, the charge that broke an empire. The winged hussars themselves would continue to terrorize Europe's battlefields for another century, their reputation burnished by Klushino and a dozen other triumphs. They were not invincible, no army is, but they were as close as the 17th century ever produced. When the wings beat and the lances leveled, armies broke. It was that simple. For Russia, the time of troubles dragged on. False Dmitry II was eventually murdered by his own followers. The Poles were driven from Moscow in 1612 by a popular uprising led by a butcher and a prince. The Romanov dynasty took power in 1613, and Russia slowly, painfully, began to rebuild. But the memory of Klushino lingered, a reminder of how close the kingdom had come to vanishing, and how fragile power could be when the wings of death descended from a summer sky. In the silence after the battle, after the screaming and the thunder and the breaking of armies, the field at Klushino returned to what it had always been, rolling farmland, dotted with trees, crossed by dirt roads. The crops grew again. The villages rebuilt. Life continued. But the blood had soaked into the soil, and the ghosts of 35,000 men haunted the valley, where Poland's hussars had ridden into legend and out the other side as the conquerors of Moscow.